shout. I also want to give a shout out to Maki Yoshinaga for managing the slides and also being my thinking partner, to Sam Erickson for helping with the logistics for this presentation. We have started recording the presentation, so if you're uncomfortable being recorded, it may be a good time to turn your camera off. We also have live transcriptions on. We ask that you keep your mic muted until the discussion section so that we will have a limited disruption. So today's presentation is going to be interactive, where you'll get a chance to reflect on some of the information presented in breakout rooms. This presentation will run for 2 hours. You can post questions throughout the presentation, and Lillian will respond to them at the end of the presentation. And now I want to invite Hannah Cherry, Program Coordinator for Community-Based Learning, who will lead us in land acknowledgement as a way to honor and resist erasure of Indigenous histories.
Thanks, Annie. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We are living on the ancestral lands of the Clackamas, Chinook, Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, Cowlitz, Kalapuya, Kathlamet, Kootenai, Mulala, Multnomah, Tualatin, Wasco, and other Indigenous tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River, creating communities and summer encampments. We pay respect to the elders past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. And please join us in uncovering such truth at any and all public events.
Thank you, Hannah, for walking us through the land acknowledgement. I now want to invite April Ann Fong, Instructor of Biology and Environmental Studies and Habitat Restoration Team Coordinator, to introduce our speaker, Lillian A. Tsai. I want to especially thank April Ann for connecting us to Lillian and helping us coordinate this presentation.
Thank you, Annie. Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for coming to learn about AAPI history. My name is April Ann Fong, and my Chinese name is Fong Yuk Ping. I use she, they pronouns. I teach biology and environmental studies at PCC Sylvania. I'm a third-generation Chinese American with roots from San Francisco, Chinatown. I am so honored today to introduce our speaker. I was intrigued to attend a cultural competency opportunity offered by Meals on Wheels for their volunteers this summer, where I learned many things I didn't know about Asian American and Pacific Islander history from Lillian Tsai. Thank you, Lillian, for doing all this research and for sharing your information and knowledge with us today. Asian hate has been very difficult for me, and I appreciate everyone here for being here to learn about our history in the United States. Lillian is an award-winning coach, consultant, facilitator, trainer, and was born and raised in Malaysian Borneo. She moved to the United States at age 19. After she completed her associate degree, she spent 25 years in global marketing and corporate communications, which culminated in an expatriate assignment as director of corporate marketing in Germany. In 2002, Lillian started her private practice focusing on intercultural communications, which she has since integrated with diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Over the past 19 years, she's worked with dozens of different kinds of clients, including academia like us, architecture, construction, corrections, environment, finance, sportswear, food and beverage, healthcare, law enforcement, manufacturing, government, parks and rec, etc. Wow, so many, transportation, steel, youth and family services. Many presentations. Thank you for sharing so much, Lillian. She's also a proud and involved grandmother of a 7-year-old boy and she also enjoys hiking, Pilates, gardening, and traveling in her spare time. And with that, I introduce Lillian Tsai. Thank you for coming.
Lillian, you're muted. We can't hear you.
I was worried about sharing my screen, so now I'm going to share my screen. I've done this a zillion times. You'd think I know better by now. But anyway, thank you so much, April, to Anne, to Maki, Hannah, and also Sam, and Portland Community College, the AAPI Affinity Group, the Office of Equity and Inclusion, and the Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence for hosting this talk, and mostly for all of you for joining us. So I wanted to have say a caveat right up front is I'm not a historian, being in academia, that's kind of scary. However, what I am and who I am is somebody who 6 months ago felt lost when the Atlanta killings happened. I felt lost, despondent, depressed, demotivated. And after hearing thousands of these hate instances, against AAPIs on top of the polarization in this country that's been happening for so long. So on top of that, trying to stay healthy and positive during a pandemic. So what I saw myself doing was sobbing at a drop of a hat, and I started questioning my purpose. I've been doing this DEI work for over 15 years. What am I doing? What can I do more? Have I even moved the needle? And so what I started doing was when COVID hit back in last year, my work went down. I lost clients who didn't want to do anything. So I started channeling my anger and my depression and frustration into a sense of healing by creating a presentation like this. So I started to attend every webinar I could, every panel discussion I could with AAPI leaders around the country. I started to do my own research about the history, which because I wasn't born here, honestly, I didn't have a lot of knowledge about, with the hope that everything that I'm doing will help not just me, but it would benefit my clients and everybody who wishes to understand and learn more about my community. So this is you could call a grassroots movement, and change starts with one person. So I want to be that person who does the change, who institutes the change. So you probably wonder why I call this presentation 171 years of bad days. Why the term bad days? So as I'm speaking, I will ask rhetorical questions like this. I invite you to put things in the chat. I may not always be able to glance. I have 2 screens, so you may see me looking over there. So feel free to answer these questions on chat. But the reason why I use the term bad days is because some of you remember when Atlanta killings happened. The Sheriff's Department were talking about the shootings, and when they asked about the shooter, the sheriff's spokesperson said, well, he was just having a bad day. Well, we all know that it was more than just a bad day. So what I like to do then is for the next about hour is to talk about, we AAPIs have had over 170 years of these bad days. So I'm going to go through some history. Obviously, I can't do every single line of history, but I will highlight some of the major ones. And I'm going to start by sharing who were the first known Asians to arrive in the United States. Who do you think were the ones? We know that the Chinese, the Filipinos, the Indians, Japanese, and Koreans all came, but who actually were the first ones to set foot in the United States? Does anybody know? Feel free to put that in the chat. Okay, so actually they were Filipinos who arrived in Morro Bay in California in October of 1587. By the way, decades before the Europeans landed on Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, followed by East Indians in Virginia in 1635, followed by the Chinese who arrived in Hawaii in 1778, And they arrived because they were fleeing the economic consequences of the Opium Wars in China. And then the Japanese, who arrived on May 7th in 1843, and finally with the Koreans in 1884, and also Vietnamese in the 1970s because of the American War. They call it the American War, we call it the Vietnam War. So a little known fact about Filipinos is that they were a lot of farm workers, and they were called manongs, or elders, and they actually played a very significant role in striking for better pay for 5 years. And they were led by this militant labor leader, Larry Itliong, who helped build the farm workers movement, organizing and striking alongside Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the United Farm Workers for better pay and working conditions. How many of you know this? And by the way, newsflash, in October 12th of this year, Mr. Itliong was just inducted posthumously into the California Hall of Fame by the governor, who said that we all benefit from Larry's leadership and apologetic advocacy. And so he is indeed one of the most important civil rights leaders of the 20th century, who has been largely overlooked in US history books. So I'm going to start by sharing also these 171 years of exclusion and bad days. And you'll see in slides that are going to come up is highlighted text in yellow. And the reason why I highlighted that in yellow are the injustices done to AAPIs. So let's talk about the railroad. And many of us know 25,000 Chinese actually came to the US in the 19th century to work in gold mines. But when that dried up, they started to work on the Transcontinental Railroad that connects East and West. Now, the piece that the Chinese worked on was actually the Western piece that started in San Francisco Bay, and they ended in Utah, in Promontory Summit. And then for the East, the Eastern link was worked on by the Irish. So on this day, on May 10th in 1869, that's when the two railroads officially joined together. And by the way, history says that 3 Chinese died for every 2 miles of railroad that was built. Many suffered also from homesickness, and most of which was actually unrecorded. And they worked for less than $1 a day, which for the most part, they sent the money home because that's what most Asians do. And over 20,000 pounds of remains of China, over 1,000 Chinese who died was sent home to the home country. So what's important about this picture, and you see it in a lot of history in Wikipedia and a lot of places about the railroad history, is you'll notice there's not one Chinese person in this frame. Not one Chinese is in this frame. Do you know why? You can probably guess. It's because they told Chinese people you cannot be in the frame. Who was in the frame? The Irish and the Americans, or the locals. And so that, do you think, was justice? Absolutely not. So they worked under the most difficult conditions, including blasting with dynamite these big hillsides and mountains so that the railroad could go through it. And then they were accused of taking jobs from white Americans. I'm going to show you a few more pictures of them doing the work. And of course, many of the Chinese came from southern China, and they had never experienced snow before. When you build a railroad through these high terrains, there is going to be snow. And that's why a lot of them died and suffered from these horrific conditions. So because the Chinese were accused of taking jobs from white Americans, several horrific instances then occurred, such as in 1871, known as the largest mass lynching in US history, happened in Los Angeles of any single racial group. But the convictions were overturned due to so-called technicalities, and the perpetrators were freed. So here you see, and then I want to talk about the Rock Springs massacre of 28 Chinese miners and Union Pacific workers, where several of the homes were burned and 15 were injured. But again, 16 were arrested, but they were not convicted. So I'm going to show you some of the pictures of the mass lynching that happened. I'm sorry if it's Very traumatizing, but you know, these need to be shown to show, I'm not going to hide any of this information anymore. And then some of these images in San Francisco where this happened, you know, they were protesting Chinese. Actually, it was also in Tacoma where a woman, a pregnant woman, in 1885, the whites burst into her home, dragged her out by her hair, and forced to march alongside 300 other Chinese immigrants into the cold, driving rain night, and they were driven to the wilderness while their homes burned alongside all the evidence of their lives. So they had nowhere to go but into perpetual flight. And again, in Tacoma, the mayor actually organized a gathering to get the Chinese out. And you see some of the horrific pictures at the time about the Chinese must go. And this message by the San Francisco School Board about children should not be placed in any position where their youthful impressions may be affected by association with pupils of the Mongolian race. And if you remember, race was broken down in Mongoloids, Caucasoids, and also Negroids. And so that's why they called us Mongolians. There was several years ago here in Portland at the Oregon Historical Society, there was an exhibit called Beyond the Gate. And I went there and I took several pictures. And this is where I got the picture of the sign in Tacoma, the post in Tacoma, and also of these books. And so these books really caught my attention because of the title. So if you look at the one with the yellow arrow, it says Chinese immigration and the physiological causes of the decay of a nation. So blaming Chinese for, you know, for making the white people less than. And then this red book called The Foul Contagious Disease, a phase of the Chinese question, how the Chinese women are infusing a poison into the Anglo-Saxon blood. So there's a lot of this blaming, and there's a term called endogamy, which is restricting marriage to people within the same caste and the same racial group. It's actually an ironclad foundation of any caste system that started from ancient India to the early American colonies to Nazi regime in Germany. And it was also brutally enforced in the US for vast majority of its history. And disallowing marriage between Blacks, for example, and white majority was common. And so the same thing also happened between Asians and whites when they viewed Asian women as a poison, regarding them as not only less than human, but as an enemy, as not of their kind, but as a threat that must be held in check at all costs, as you're seeing and hearing today. And so I actually wanted to go back to the, sorry, I missed out on this. The Hell's Cannon, sorry, where did I put that? Okay, so I wanted to talk about the Hell's Cannon massacre, also known as the Snake River Massacre, also known as the Chinese Massacre at Deep Creek. That really was one of the deadliest attacks against Chinese American in Chinese American US history. Now, the Hell's Cannon was actually the deepest cannon in North America. Sorry, yeah, here it is. It's the deepest cannon in North America that's more than 2,000, it's 2,000 feet deeper than the Grand Canyon, and it's difficult to reach, as you can see, because of its sheer plunging cliffs, its fast flowing river, and the Chinese laborers were going there to mine gold, and they call it powdery, they called it flour gold because it was a fine powder that floats in the bodies of water near the gold mines. And so they wanted to escape all the anti-Chinese sentiment that was going at the time. So they decided to go to this remote area, hoping that they would be safe. Well, guess what? They weren't. So there were about 31 to 34 Chinese men who worked there, and they were ambushed over a 2-day period in May of 1887. One tried to escape, but they were quickly chased down by this gang of actually horse thieves, by 7 of them. And so this one person was actually chased down, bludgeoned to death with a rock, Then everybody's bodies were mutilated and dumped into the Snake River. After that, they stole the gold, they burned the camp and all the equipment. And in an article in the San Bernardino Daily Courier in July of the same year, they claimed that the public had every reason to believe that the miners had been murdered by their own countrymen, not by whites or Indians as was first supposed. However, the investigation concluded otherwise. And this is a memorial, if you see to the right of that site. So like previous acts of violence you just heard against Asian immigrants at the end of the 19th century, the identity of 7 murderers was actually known, but none of them were convicted or punished, and largely forgotten until a Wallowa county clerk discovered the details that were locked away in the safe, hidden from public eye. So let's talk about something that actually happened here in Oregon, in St. John's in northern Portland, in northern part of Portland in March of 1910, where 200 local residents attacked Sikhs who were from the Punjabi region of Northwest India, who had been arriving in Oregon and Washington since 1906. By the end of the day in March, they were forcibly placed on trains and sent south to Portland. And the reason is that trouble had been brewing for some time due to the number of immigrants who consistently were increasing at the St. John's lumber mill. You remember, Oregon, huge lumber country. And white men then had been replaced by what they called turbaned fellows, with a strong feeling of animosity toward them was engendered. So the riot was often explained as a labor dispute. And the St. John's Review, which is the paper at the time, quipped about turbaned fellows. And all this language then reveals the racial prejudice that actually underlined the entire conflict. In 1924, you can see there was yet another act banning Asian immigration, as if the 1882 Exclusion Act wasn't enough. And that is something I didn't want to go over because most people will know about the 1882 Exclusion Act, which was the one and only act against a racial group in this country that was renewed twice, and then it wasn't ever revoked for actually 60 years. So this is yet another injustice. Let's move forward to World War II. As we all know, over 110, some say 110,000 Japanese, many of them were born here in America, American citizens, were sent to internment camps, I call them concentration camps, and over 1,800 of them actually died. And did you know this, and I didn't even know this until I dug really deep, that Japanese women were actually sterilized without their consent or knowledge at Tule Lake in California. And here are some images of the time, hauling them into these buses to take them into the camps. And also this just breaks my heart because I have children and those of you have children. And these are the trucks that usually you take cattle to the market, right? But these little kids, look at this little girl and these little boys being hauled off to the internment camps. And here's the internment camp behind barbed wire. And what's known also is that when they moved into the concentration camp, a lot of them were actually not ready. It happened so quickly, they actually had to sleep on very, very cold mud grounds. So this next piece is something that not a lot of people know. Some of people who have been in the military may know about that. So what really hurts me is that on the one hand, the American government sent Japanese women, the elderly, and children to concentration camps. On the other hand, 14,000 second generation Nisei Japanese Americans, who were mostly from Hawaii, made up this 442nd Infantry Regiment and also the 100th Infantry Battalion. And they became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in US military history. They earned 18,000 military honors. You can read it all here: Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts, Presidential Unit Citations, Medals of Honor. And what we don't know is they fought in Europe. They were actually in France. They were part of the heroic rescue of the Lost Battalion. They were in Italy, they were in Germany, where they liberated at least one of the labor camps of Dachau, the concentration camp, and they saved survivors of a death march. So how many of you learned this in your history lessons? There's another atrocity I wanted to bring up, and yes, it did not happen in America. However, it involved 100 US troops in My Lai. It's the My Lai massacre in 1968, where over 500 Vietnamese villagers were killed. The women were raped and mutilated, their village burned, and all but one US troop, American troop, was convicted. I suspected he became the scapegoat and took the fall. And these are other events that you may have heard about the shooting in 1989 of Cambodian and Vietnamese refugee children. And also they were killed in Stockton, California. So let's talk about the 1990 to 1992 riots in Los Angeles. Many of us know about this, and the riots happened following the brutal beating in 1990 of Rodney King by some police officers who were acquitted on all but one charge. So that's why a lot of these incidents happened. What we don't know is that the riots started after acquittal, 5 days, and also it destroyed over 2,300 Korean businesses and uprooted 10,000 Korean Americans from their homes and businesses, totaling a $1 billion damage. What we must also understand, however, that in the year before the riots began, in April of 1992, there was already growing resentment and violence between African Americans and Korean American communities. And these racial tensions had been simmering for years between these groups. Many Korean shopkeepers were actually upset because they suspected shoplifting from the Black customers and neighbors. Many Black customers were angry because they were routinely disrespected, humiliated by Korean store owners. But neither group fully understood the extent or sheer enormity of the cultural differences and language barriers, which further fueled these tensions. And back then they didn't have intercultural communications to try and understand both sides' culture. So sadly, this tension still exists today between many Asians and Blacks, and something we need to be aware of, and something both communities need to find ways to unpack so that we can heal, reconcile, and which is something that I know has been tried by certain communities, some more successful than others. But still, the deep-seated hatred and discrimination exists, which saddens me a lot. Let me also now talk about another incident, and this is important because this incident became a turning point for Asian American civil rights engagement and a rallying cry for stronger federal hate crime legislation. So Vincent Chin was born in China. He was adopted by a Chinese couple who couldn't have kids from an orphanage at age 6. He then was, the couple moved to America, and he was known to be outgoing, friendly. He was an engineer, and he was about to marry his longtime girlfriend. Now, the week before the wedding, he and his buddies went to a bar to celebrate. And while he was there, some altercation happened between him and 2 men. What happened was then he left the bar and they took the fight outside, and one of them actually took a baseball bat and bludgeoned him to death. So the 400 people who were supposed to be at his wedding actually attended his funeral. Now, why did this happen? It was a time when 1 in 5 people, and this happened in Detroit, Michigan. And the time that it happened was that 1 in 5 Detroiters were actually out of a job because of the Japanese auto industry. And they wanted somebody to blame. Again, the scapegoating happens again. And so Japan had now cornered the market in fuel-saving cars. And so the Japanese, and then in this case, a Chinese was mistaken for Japanese. He took the fall. So he was scapegoated, profiled, and blamed for these job losses. And by the way, there's a documentary called Who Killed Vincent Chin that was made in 1988 after his death. It was nominated for an Academy Award in 1989 for Best Documentary. So, interesting is that the two men, and these are the two men, Michael Nitz and Ronald Ebens, who are father and son, is that the judge found Ebens guilty of the second count and sentenced to 25 years. And Nitz was actually acquitted of both counts. And what's interesting is that neither of them served a day in jail. The judge actually said this, and I quote, "Vincent Chin's life wasn't worth as much as a white man's, and that's why these guys never spent a day in jail. Although 5 years later, he was ordered to pay $1.5 million at only $200 a month." How long do you think that takes? And how do you bring back a life? So you tell me if this is justice. And even this Ronald Ebens said, he was even surprised, and he actually pled guilty to manslaughter. And he was absolutely surprised that he wasn't in jail. So let's go forward to 9/11, which, we just celebrated many years of that. How many hate instances do you think have been reported against Asians since 9/11? I mean, they're still happening today. And in how many cities do you think they've been known to happen? 500 hate instances within several months of these instances in over 18 different cities, from Minneapolis to Arlington, Texas, to Columbia, to Washington, D.C., to St. Petersburg, Florida, Seattle, Salt Lake City, etc. This is actually documented in a Justice Government website. So all these crimes were mostly against Muslims and Sikhs, who were profiled and stereotyped as terrorists due to the wearing of the headscarves and turbans. My Saudi Arabian friends who were born here were also profiled and attacked. And what was also happened, and these are the Sikhs who were demonstrating against the violence against their community. And as a result of 9/11, these are the instances that happened even 6 years later in many years later, not just 6 years later, many years later, when a male here in Gresham, Oregon, asked to use a bathroom at a Sikh temple, and then he proceeded to attack a Sikh woman and attempted to rape and sexually assaulted her. But guess what? The police said that there was no evidence due to race or religion. So let's come to the current COVID era, where COVID has been blamed on China because of the rhetoric from our government, and the virus being called the Kung flu, the Asian virus, you name it, every disease comes from China. And therefore, all this anti-Asian hate started in March of last year. There's a group called Stop Asian Hate, who's been tracking these, and now they're only able to track the ones that have been reported. And as Asians, sometimes we don't want to make trouble. And so we tend to say, no, we're not going to rock the boat. We don't want to stay in anything. So these are just instances that happen. So I've been tracking this for a while, and I had to keep updating this chart because in the beginning, in an 11th month period, there were 3,795. And then within a year, it was over 6,000 in 29 cities. And in August of this year, they have now jumped to over 9,000 instances. That's over 3,000 a month. So if you do the math, that's quite a lot. So over a 5-month period, it's an increase of 2,478. That's 495 a month and averages to 16 a day. But as I said, what about those who are not reported? Okay. And I'm not sure if this has happened to any other racial group. And by the way, as of August 30th, the FBI, this year, the FBI reported that the number of hate crimes in the US rose in 2020 to the highest level in 12 years, propelled by increasing assaults targeting Black and also Asian victims. And crime has increased anywhere between 30 to 60%, depending on where you are in 2021 alone. Clearly an unacceptable and tragic statistic. Let me share some comments that I've collected from media about how Asian Americans are being bullied and scapegoated. So what really was upsetting, because my lovely grandson is a second grader, and here's a second grader saying, I don't like China or Chinese people because they started this quarantine. Where do you think that comes from? Where do you think they heard it from? And then, you know, you're in academia, so another classmate in New York talking to an Asian student, you want to go to a wet market together and get corona. And this happens a lot, is, you know, go back to where you came from. And here in Portland, several Asians were punched and assaulted at the Max stop and also at the TriMet stop. Excuse me, I gotta take a sip. So these are horrific things to say to us who are being scapegoated. And this last one was really an Uber driver who was coughed on, and this is him. And somehow he recorded the incident, and he was coughed on by this 24-year-old woman of color after he ended that ride because she wasn't wearing a mask. And so a fellow passenger then pepper sprayed him and they fled the scene. Now, later, this woman actually turned herself in. She was charged with attempted robbery, assault and battery on a hired transport driver, and she had a COVID health code violation, but she was out on bail after spending one night in jail and paying $75,000 bail. Wonder where that money came from. So let's go forward to a 3-month period between the end of last year and March of this year, before the Atlanta killings. Did you know that actually 5 Asian men died in various cities around the country? I didn't know this until I started doing the research. And these 2 young men actually had mental health disorders, all from different cities around the country, from the West to the East Coast. And Atlanta is what we all know, where 6 Asian women were killed, and the killer, Robert Aaron Long, was actually accused of killing 8 people across 2 counties, including the 7 people here, and he pled guilty to 4 murder charges, and thus faces 4 consecutive life sentences without parole. The prosecutor, however, is seeking the death penalty. And just a month later, the tragic killing of 4 Sikhs who all worked overtime at FedEx, overnight shift at FedEx, sorry. And it happened to be the 45th mass shooting in 30 days when it happened. Clearly unacceptable. And the instances keep happening. So I started tracking through the Asian media that I've been following on Instagram and wherever I get my hands on. And by the end of July, I was exhausted because they kept going on in August. And I thought, I'm going to run out of slides. I'm going to run out of time to talk about this. So just last week, I saw this on my Instagram news that a woman was yelling anti-Asian slurs at a 17-year-old and hit her with a cardboard box. I'm thinking, when is this going to stop? I have absolutely no idea. We also just passed the Olympics, which was a wonderful event, and thank goodness no massive outbreak of the virus happened. But what did happen was several athletes actually came forward and said that they too had been experiencing anti-Asian hate. And this gentleman on the left, Yul Moldar, who was adopted by American parents, he's Korean, said that where he lives, which is in Colorado, a woman cut him off while he was driving. And then when he was stopped at a red light, she screamed to him, "Go back to China." And a Paralympic tennis star, Dana Mathewson, which is this woman, the second on the right, was the subject of Asian jokes, even made by her own friends. And they even asked her, "Did you bring COVID here?" She said that they didn't do it with malicious intent. However, people just don't understand the gravity of their words and what they're saying. You know, these are, you can call them microaggressions, but I call them macroaggressions, and they're racist. So, but she did say she feels the Olympics was an opportunity to show people what we Asian Americans can do. And this other incident, which I'm sure not many of you know, if you see the gesture by the Serbian woman volleyball player, and the match that they were playing was actually against the Thailand team, the Thai team. And she was seen by, and this is captured by a reporter, of making this gesture with her eyes that prompted the two Hawaiian brothers, Eric and Kawika, these two gentlemen who were brothers, were also in the Olympics, to say something on social media, and that's how I picked it up. And as a result, thank goodness, the Serbian team was suspended for 2 matches and the Serbian Federation was fined. By the way, this is not just limited to sports and also everyday life. There's an article in the New York Times on July 21st of this year that even though Asians are represented in classical music, they still face routine racism and discrimination. They don't feel seen, they don't feel heard, and stereotyped that their music making is soulless and mechanical, and they're treated as outsiders all the time. And also they're targets of ongoing slurs. So what we're now going to do now is, Sam, if you don't mind, we're going to put you in breakout rooms. I think it's about 4. There's about 77 of you. We're going to have you answer this question. What is your reaction to what you've learned so far in the historical timeline? We just want you to talk about it. You know, I've given you a lot of information, and I will not be coming into your breakout rooms because I actually need to rest my voice. But I'd like you to really share with the people in your breakout room about your reaction and also how these instances have affected you. A lot of you have put it in the chat. So we're going to time you. Sam, could you open the rooms now, please? I'll see you back here in 15 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. We'll wait a few more seconds for everybody to join us. Welcome back, everyone. What I'd like to do is to have a few of you share your discussion in your rooms, share your experiences and your reactions to what you learned. And I'd love to know how many of you actually learned any of these in your history books, in your history lessons growing up here. So anybody, you can raise your hand physically or use the raise hand icon. Yes, Bob, Tab?
Hi, so first off, thank you so much for the presentation. I knew some of this history, but not all of it. We were having the conversation in our group that this sort of education should be more widespread. And I think very few people get this in their formal education, you know, particularly during our formative years when we're young like this. I think the term I used is US history is often sort of a hagiography where we only talk about, you know, the high points and don't present the history warts and all.
Thank you. I'm curious, Bob, what did you hear about? Which of these?
Well, I had a pretty good awareness of the concentration camps, as you rightly labeled them, and you know, some of the military history. I knew some about you know, labor conditions in the West, but I'm from the East Coast, and history is a little bit like politics, and it's being local, and so just that information is less prevalent back east. But again, even in the West, I think it probably doesn't get the attention it deserves.
Right, right. Thank you. And thank you, Angela, for sharing. I would not have passed this history test. Yeah, and somebody, Lori chimed in with that too. And somebody also said that Certificate on Asian Studies at PCC is not well marketed. Just learned about it today from April. And some of you learned about it through Oregon Historical Society, Whiteness History Month, and other resources not in the history classes. Okay, thank you. Anyone else? I don't see any hands, but I can't see all the screens. There's over 64 of you. So if you can just unmute yourself and chime in.
I'll add something else while people are putting their thoughts together. Years ago when I was in my first trip to the West Coast, I went to a historical society in the Transamerica building in San Francisco. This is probably 40 years ago, and picked up a book of poetry from some of the folks that were on Angel Island when they were immigrating to the US. And that's probably when I first started to get a feel for some of those other issues that you were talking about. So it's actually the only book of poetry I own.
Right, right.
So.
And how did it affect you? I'm curious.
I guess, you know, sort of a sense of being a fellow traveler, you know, being a minority in the US, and, you know, having additional appreciation for this sort of limitations of history as it's taught.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Yes, Rebecca.
So I was really lucky because I went to school in the Bay Area, and one day somebody came into our classroom and did an hour and a half presentation on Asian American Pacific Islanders specifically, and she was Asian American, and it was a really great 8th grade, and then nothing else happened the rest of my college or high school career, just that one. As far as school goes.
Right.
And she couldn't go into any of this because she had another agenda, which is just, you know, to explain what it's like to be not part of the majority population.
Right, right. Yeah, in San Francisco in the early days, they also put Chinese in separate schools. So it was segregated schools in San Francisco. Yeah. I want to thank Martha Bailey for sharing that. If anyone wants to know more about the Asian Studies Focus Award, feel free to contact her later. And she's been involved ever since it was created. Thank you so much. And Cameron shared that in his breakout room, there were quite a few Native Oregonians who did not learn about this in their high school history classes, but one person grew up in Japan, and in Japan, they learned about these Oregon concentration camps in school. Yeah. Definitely.
Hi, Lillian. This is
Hi,
Paula.
Paula.
How you
Good
been?
to see you.
Yes, it's great to see you. I knew about the internment, that is concentration camps. I know a lot about Hawaii and the awful things we have done in Hawaii as United Statesians. I didn't know about the Snake River incidents, and I haven't had the heart to watch the news. Just like you got to the end of July, it was like I was watching them for a while. I've been on Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee where I used to work, and trying to comfort my friends who come from one Asian country after another or have that ethnicity, and just feeling so scared and so hurt. And I have a friend from Africa who talked about, you know, I wasn't Black until I got here. And before I got here, I was Somali, and there were people who were Kenyan, and there were people, but once I got here, I was Black. And I think we're doing this as exactly the same to Asian people. People have been Thai, they've been Chinese, they've been Korean, just like that young man who was adopted and was Korean, and someone told him to go back to China. I mean, we do not look at culture. We are blind to so much here. And
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. It's always
You're
great.
so welcome. Thanks for being here, Paula. I've known Paula for many, many, many years. And, you know, when I first came to this country at age 19, I never thought about myself as Asian. And when people ask me, where are you from? Oh, from Malaysia. I'm actually Malaysian. I didn't even say Malaysian Chinese. So our cultural identities are things that we actually discover for ourselves, right? Unless you want other people to identify you. So we need to own our own cultural identity. I was told once that you're not Malaysian, you're Chinese. I said, I'm Malaysian Chinese. And that is what I relate to. And that's a very, very strong identity for me. There's parts of me that very, very Malaysian. So, okay.
Thank you. Great
You're
to see
welcome,
you.
Paula. Thank you. Anyone else before we move on? There's lots of stuff in the chat. Martha said she wrote a paper for a high school history class. in Vancouver, comparing the Japanese concentration camps to those by the Confederacy during the Civil War. Would love to read that. That's awesome. Thank you. All right, I have a little bit more. I think I have about 20 minutes more to my presentation. So let me share my screen again. But thank you, everybody, for staying with me. There's a little bit more we're going to talk about. All right, so let's go into some of the Asian facts and figures, which maybe not everybody knows, is that we are 4.3 billion people in Asia alone. And if the world is over 7 billion, we comprise more than 50% of the world's population. And in the US, according to the 2020 census, we are actually 7.2% of the US population. And we've had the fastest growth in the last 10 years. Over 50% of us are foreign born from 77 different countries. And so just lumping us all together does a great disservice. We should be identified by our countries and the countries that we identify with. We represent many, many different cultures, subcultures, ethnicities, languages, dialects, and also religion. And we are also, and yet, if we're over 7% of the population, but there's also very, very small representation in the Fortune 100 or Fortune 500 companies. We also have the largest income gap of all racial groups, and I'm not sure if everybody knows that. And so according to the Pew Research Center, we are both the highest income earners and also the lowest, with many falling below the federal poverty level, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders in particular have more of their group below the poverty level, over 17.5% of them belonging to that group. So, talking about us as model minorities, and by the way, I challenge all of you to name a famous Asian American who's not an athlete and not a movie star. How many of you can name one? A famous Asian American who's not a movie star or an athlete. Put that in the chat, please. Kamala Harris, yeah, or in politics. I'm glad you said Kamala. Yes, thank you, Daphne. And are you related to Daphne? Because you have the same last name. I should have been asked.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
It's a very common last name though.
Right, and actually I was gonna talk about in a minute. Yo-Yo Ma, okay, musician, great. Lisa Ling, wonderful TV personality. But what about business people? Amy Tan, yes, author. Yes, thank you. Yo-Yo is great, love him. Michio Kaku, okay, I'm not familiar with that name. Jade, what is her background? What is her claim to fame?
He's a scientist.
Ah, neuroscientist, thank you so much.
No, theoretical physicist. He's a scientist.
Thank you. Great. So there's a whole bunch coming in. Terrence Tao, Elaine Chin, Ali Wong. Yes, Ali Wong. She's the producer, right, or director in movies. Jean Kwok. Yeah, I'm not even familiar with all of those, but I decided to kind of, challenge myself, and I was surprised at a lot of them that I actually didn't know. So how many of you know who any of these are? These are founders of some very, very famous companies who produce tools that we use almost every single day. All right, Bose, the headsets and also the speakers. He's Indian, American. Eric Lee, who founded LinkedIn, and Sarah Lee and Christine Chang founded this, what they called a K-beauty brand called Glow Recipe. And then Stephen Chen, who founded YouTube. Ty Lee is she's a IT provider, and she's a Thai-born Korean co-owner and CEO of this country that is an IT provider for 20,000 companies, including Boeing and AT&T. And of course, Eric Yuan, who founded Zoom, the very platform we're on, he used to work at WebEx and also Cisco. But how many of these are actually household names, right? Like Jeff Bezos and various other people. So this is something that we need to start changing, is to raise. Sorry, does somebody want to say something? Okay, all right. So what I also wanted to do was, thank you, Daphne, is to highlight Michelle Wu, who just last night was the first ever Asian American woman in US history to become mayor of a major city. And I tell you, this morning when I was watching her videos, I'm tingling right now, I started crying. I just bawled my eyes out because yes, thank goodness, finally, we have an Asian American woman who is in a major city. And by the way, Boston was the first city I ever landed in when I came to the United States at age 19. So I have a lot of affinity for the city. So let's talk about this myth of the mono-minority stereotype and how many of us know where it started. So the first earliest uses of the term was actually in 1966 at a New York Times Magazine article written by sociologist William Peterson that described Asian Americans as ethnic minorities who, despite marginalization, achieved success. So they were talking about, so the article, the essay is actually called Success Story Japanese American Style, where he wrote about Japanese cultures, having strong work ethic and family values, which consequently, he said, prevented them from becoming a problem minority. And so the mono-minority suggests upward mobility, but it creates a fallacy that we don't experience struggle or racial discrimination. And the problem is that it's bolstered in many cases by flawed media representation, like films like Crazy Rich Asians and Bling Empire, and also being on the cover of Time magazine as Asian American whiz kids. And so this is where the article was publicized in the newspapers, and a lot of media since then, throughout the 80s, the 70s and 80s, had used the term to ascribe Asian American socioeconomic successes, while at the same time, we were also marginalized and racially segregated. So the reason for the term is that Asian Americans are seen as less of a threat, as you heard, and the problem is that what it did was it drove a wedge between Asian Americans and also specifically African Americans or Black Americans. Because what the message was, hey, look at those Asians, they're great. How come despite all this marginalization, discrimination, and being interned, they're successful? Well, what about you? So they did it as a way of shaming African Americans and also other people of color. So unfortunately, you know, this has also created the stereotype about us, and we are often overlooked and made assumptions that we have class privilege, we have high socioeconomic status and education, and that discrimination doesn't really happen or whatever happens to us is not viewed as legitimate. And that's why I'm speaking up about it. So that's why in the early days of the violence against AAPIs, it was a whole year after they started in March of 2020 until Atlanta happened that the instances were not covered by the media. So that is why we need to all speak up about it. So another reason why I'm feeling the way that I feel, that we are invisible, is that I get the Oregon Health Authority report every single day on COVID, because I like to know, you know, what counties, where they're increasing or not. And so in February, there was a report, a general report that reported on the vaccination progress for people of color. Well, I scanned it and looked for Asian American. Do you see Asian American on this list? Absolutely not. They covered every racial group, and Native Americans, I will also say, are also often left out of the race conversation. So I was livid at this point, and that's what also drove me to stand up more to make sure that we are more visible. I cannot talk about the instances of anti-Asian hate without talking about the burden that we AAPI women actually bear, and there's a lot of statistics about it. Several places where I've gathered this information is that we are over 60% of these hate instances. How many pictures have you seen, videos have you seen against older Asian women? And there's a rise in domestic violence because of the state of the economy, Many of us are unemployed because many of Asian women are in the service industry. Over 20% of AAPI women have reported to have been stalked in her lifetime. I'm here to tell you that I have been. And over 50% report racism has impacted their lives, either slightly or a lot. And I have been the subject of both microaggressions and also macroaggressions, where I am sitting in a restaurant with 7 other women, white women, business associates, and we're ordering, and I'm the last person to be asked to give my order, and the waitress completely ignored me. So I'm wondering what is going on. Does she not see me? So, that's why sometimes I feel very, very invisible and unseen. And this last one is about on a panel that I was listening to, and a statement made by Mr. B.J. Park, who is the deputy DA here in Multnomah County in Oregon. And he actually talked to one of the perpetrators, one of the people who hate Asians. And he said, why do you target Asian women? And this is what the perpetrator said. He said, because they're easy. They're easy targets. They're demure. They're soft. They're small. They're submissive. They're obedient. They don't speak up. They're quiet. They work hard. And they have money and they have nice stuff in their purses, in their cars, and in their house. So we've become easy targets. Well, they haven't seen me. I'm 5'7", and I dare anybody come at me. I walk down the street. I do a walk almost every evening, rain or shine. And I walk with a lot of self-confidence. And this is a lesson for all of us, is we need to not hide. Because if we hide, that also confirms that we are invisible. So walk down the street, hold yourself up, and if you have to, bring a walking stick with you. Okay, if that's a protection. And friends of mine have even offered to give me mace and give me pepper spray and bear spray. They say bear spray is better because it reaches further. So I haven't gone that far. But so far, I think I feel okay, but obviously it's not for everyone. So let me end with, what can PCC do? You've done a lot. You've made a lot of public statements on your website. You have also the day after the Atlanta shootings, President Mitsui and also your Chief Diversity Officer, Tricia Brand, made a public statement standing in solidarity with us. That's awesome. Solidarity with your students, with your faculty, and also with your staff. And so you also provided lots of important resources for reporting, counseling, employee assistance programs, and also a link to the bystander intervention training, which I also experienced, by the way, with I Holla Back. It was a great training, and they provided it for free to the Asian community. And that indeed is a model of how organizations can stand up for people of color. In addition, I understand that PCC's equity plan, which launches this winter, has 6 key objectives that prioritizes DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and enhances efforts already in progress to accelerate transformative change. So you also have multiple steering and action groups and district leaders of Diversity Council who have already had plans in place for DEI. So you're on the way. I also believe that there's more that can be done on a more personal level, interpersonal level. So whether you're staff, faculty, if you're a manager, a supervisor, you're a leader, personally check in with any of your AAPI staff, your faculty, your students, your people who work for you, your colleagues, even your suppliers and vendors, and also some of your partners. You know, a simple thing like, hey, this incident just happened. I wanted to see how you're doing. That's all you need to say. Don't have to go into much. Just the mere fact of checking in means that you care. And make sure everybody does their own personal work. And if you haven't studied Asian American history or have a lot of Asian friends, then lean into that discomfort. This work in DEI is really about being comfortable with being uncomfortable. The work is not comfortable. And also, lastly, extending your social justice efforts to developing this, what I call a shared vision of what anti-racism looks like. It's really about what should the experiences of AAPIs and BIPOC look like at PCC? What should the experiences of white people look like? Because in order for DEI to work fully, we have to include white people in the conversation. And then what is happening now at PCC that should no longer happen? So what's working, but what isn't happening that needs to happen? So it's really a conversation and a dialogue to have. More that you can do is what I've done actually since this incident. I had a few clients reach out to me and I said that let's have this presentation and also let me do some listening sessions with up to 5 or 10 people at the same time. I've done it at PGE, I've done it at the Port of Portland, where AAPIs can sign up and they just come in the room and I listen to them about, sharing what's going on for them, what's coming up for them, because they feel safe with me. They don't always feel safe with somebody else. And making sure that we get rid of that model minority stereotype that Asians can't be good leaders, because we can, we are. And just because some of us may be viewed and perceived as more quiet and not speaking up doesn't mean that we can't be good leaders. So recalibrate our potential as leaders. Offering workshops, I already said that about what you already have a link to. And make sure we donate to all the businesses like APANO, which is the Pan-Asian American Network of Oregon. And restaurants that I like to go to are, actually love Swagat here in Hillsborough. And I go to, Chinatown restaurant and also Fovan, which is in several locations around town. There are also several Asian nonprofits in Oregon that you can contribute to. And I'm sure I haven't covered all of them. So if you know of any in addition to this list, feel free to send it to me. We are also collecting on the side a Google Doc that has a whole bunch of resources. And I believe Annie and Maki are figuring out how to get it to all of you. So what can each of you do personally is to educate yourself deeply and broadly, and also share how you felt about this presentation with your friends, with your family, your colleagues, your network, and lean into the learning. And most importantly, get rid of those assumptions and stereotypes of who we are, because each and every one of us is an individual and very, very different. I'd like you to go beyond being an ally, beyond being a bystander, because what do bystanders do? They stand by. But an upstander is somebody who stands up for someone who actually gets into action. We'd like you to call your state reps and your senators and demand their support, advocate for gun control, and also a lot of change, because this is about systemic racism. This has been going on for way too long. And then also asking for resources for mental health services, immigration, housing, education that serves our community. Most importantly, condemning that in your schools, in your school districts, at your academic institutions, and pushing for disaggregated data reporting. And this is why, for example, the OHA has trouble reporting on Asians, because they don't have any data. There are too many of us, too many of our Asian groups. And so I think they lack the resources to do it. And pushing for ethnic studies in all K through 12 schools. I remember my daughter saying to me when she was going to high school, oh, maybe 20 years ago, she said, Mom, why don't they teach about Asian American history? I said, I really don't know. So that's a good thing. So what I call on all of you here, I noticed that all of you represent different ethnic groups, different racial groups. I'd like everybody to now take a stand unitedly against all forms of oppression and racism, and to refuse to let Asians be pitted against other people of color, and committing to action and not platitudes. So I'm going to conclude by saying, as an Asian American baby boomer immigrant, I am tired, I'm disgusted, and I'm actually, frankly, very sad, because I'm exhausted, I'm hugely traumatized. Over the past 19 months, we've been battling 2 pandemics, racism and COVID-19, and also systemic racism for almost 2 centuries. On top of that, Asian Americans have been and still are treated as foreigners, outsiders, and we have lost face for almost 2 centuries. We are tired of being scapegoated, fetishized, eroticized, raped, exoticized, micro and macroaggressed, assaulted, bullied, harassed, stereotyped, minimized, unseen, and unheard. sorry, it is therefore time for all of us, all of you, to come together, all people of color and white people, to be advocates, accomplices, co-conspirators, and upstanders to stop systemic racism. It is time to end these 171 years of bad days right now, today. So will you all join with me, sorry, and all of PCC in this fight for racial and social justice? Thank you so much for being here today. I'm really touched by your presence. Thank you.
Oh, Lillian, thank you so much. Yeah, just big heart in all this. Thank you for being so real and vulnerable. And your talk has been so validating. And I'm so happy you've come and shared this with us and that you're coming to share this with our students next week. Thank you so much. I believe Annie would also like to thank you as well.
Yeah, before we go into closing the session, I just wanted to know if there were any questions we had for Lillian. You know, I see there was, I don't know if there's any questions in the chat. There was just one that Magda mentioned, that how much AAPI history is covered in education, missing histories of many people, just to comment on that. And I think you touched upon that after our, I see Josephine's hand up. Josephine, go ahead.
Josephine, go ahead.
Thank you. I really appreciate not sugarcoating it and helping us learn a lot of real history today. And I also appreciate that your call for allyship, or going beyond just calling ourselves allies and doing something. And I want to address something that I think is true in education, in educational environments. And I'm curious about your experience in corporate environments as well. And that is this desire to feel like you want to avoid conflict. Right? You see something, you think maybe that's not as bad as I thought it was. I'm going to let it slide because bringing it up is going to cause more trouble. But what happens over time is it piles up into this ugliness if we don't call it out and go through that conflict at the time. And I don't know if that, I've been in education as a professional my whole life, spent very little time other than with some advisory board members in corporate America. I'm curious to see if you've seen a difference and what advice you have for us who, when we're fighting that urge to keep polite, so to speak.
Do you have an hour? No. But thank you. That's a very, very good question. Interesting question, Josephine. So I spent more than 25 years in the corporate world, and I would say I have not experienced any racial discrimination. What I have experienced are sexual harassment. Even after I started my company 19 years ago, there were clients, or actually at least potential clients, who would ask me out under the guise of having a potential business arrangement, but they actually wanted to ask me out, and they were both married. And one of them wanted me to jump on a jet with him to a business trip, and I asked him why. He couldn't tell me. So I said, I'm not going to go. And the other one had a wife who I was coaching, and then under the pretense of, oh, I want to know how she's doing, and then inviting me to his house, because the wife was back in China. So I'm going, what the heck is going on? Do I have this label, this sign on my chest that says, harass me? No, I don't. So that's my experience. So I would say this conflict avoidance. This is something I think that is true, not only for Asian Americans, but for a lot of people. We are in the Pacific Northwest, which is called Northwest Nice or Portland Polite. Right? You've heard these terms before. And we tend not to want to have these courageous conversations, right? We are afraid of hurting people's feelings. And so how do you come into these difficult conversations and with the goal of having mutual respect and moving forward, right? So I do this all the time, conflict resolution, conflict management, I call it, because sometimes you can't actually resolve it, but you can agree to disagree, but how do you get there? So I would say, learning how to speak respectfully with each other. And the first thing I do is, instead of making assumptions about what somebody means by their action or their statement, is to ask a question. So this is what I call my intent versus impact tool. So what was your intention with that comment? What was your intention with what you just said? Help me understand. Okay. Or I'm just curious about what you just said because now the impact on me wasn't that great. I'd like to hear what your intention was. So do you think we can have a two-way conversation now? Right? Whereas if I said, well, that was stupid, that was dumb, that was racist, what do you think happens? We shut people down when we do that, right? And so I have found that these tools have really helped, and I teach a microaggressions and unconscious bias class because I link the two because they are definitely connected, because microaggressions are a result of unconscious bias, okay? And it is a two-part series. I'm actually teaching one this Friday. I'm teaching like 3 in February. So I think that's a place where I teach people on how to call out the offender. Usually it's unintentional. Call out the offender, and then what to do as an upstander or bystander, and what to do if you're the actual target. Okay, things to say. And actually, I even have some tools and tips for what do you do when it's your manager, okay, who's saying these things to you. And also, if you're a manager or person in power, what do you do? What should you say? So various different contexts for that. I hope that was helpful. Did I answer your question, Josephine?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. That was
Okay,
helpful.
great. Yeah, okay, thank you. Anyone else? Questions? I see there's a lot of chats going on. That's great. Yeah, and we get called we're too sensitive, right? Especially as women. Oh, you're so sensitive. You're too emotional. You know, this and that. And that's or they'll say, don't be so angry or something. And I'll say, I'll show you angry. Anyone else? Because I can't see all the hands. Yeah, anything else? And Magda said, many people, especially in the Northwest, perceive conflict as a bad thing and they avoid at all costs. Conflict is not a bad thing. It can lead to deep conversation and transparency, even if we do not agree with each other. Bingo, Magda. That's a really, really good comment. Yeah, and sometimes it's misunderstanding, but we like to name it as conflict. And once you name it as a conflict, people have this visceral reaction to it, right? I'm not in conflict. Yeah, and we have this assumption and stereotype about people from the East Coast when they're just being direct. It's a communication style difference. And that's where my intercultural communications training comes in, very, very helpful. Any other comments? Yeah, and thank you, Martha. This is a very helpful presentation for opening more discussions on campus. So I'd like to know what are some of the discussions that are going on in campus, in your classrooms, about racism, about anti-Asian hate. How are you having conversations about how to work more harmoniously and respectfully with each other? Did I ask a trick question?
I think one of the only classes that I teach where we actually just grapple with racism is my sustainability class, because to really truly be sustainable, we have to think about the 3 E's: the environment, economy, and equity. And that equity piece and social justice issues, environmental justice, are so huge. And so we start my class by actually making group discussion rules. Like, how do you have a conversation where we might disagree? How do we hear each other? How do we hear each other just to understand each other, not to like respond, but just to take in that information, and have it become a part of you and stew on it a little bit. And that I have found to be the most beautiful thing, just by accident, because I teach science and I'm not trained in any of this discussion-y talk stuff. And so just by winging it, it's really helped conversations a lot to have group discussion rules and to have people trust and to have people be able to say something asinine.
Yeah.
And get corrected and have them know that you said an asinine thing does not mean you're an ass.
Right, right. And there's so much of this, well, I didn't like what you said, so I'm going to shut you down. I'm going to block you, all this cancel culture stuff that actually doesn't help. Annie, I see your hands up.
Yes, I just wanted to comment that when I teach, one of the things that I try to fight is the model minority. That is so ingrained in people's minds that they don't consider the other side, right? They see that front and forward. So they can't even get into this conversation of, that facing discrimination, and they see that you should not complain because, and I think the flip side to this is we don't honor those people who are struggling in the Asian community.
Right.
And understand the pain that they are going through. So really trying to talk about that, and also distinguishing that I can speak for all Asians. That's that we are so different in our cultural practices, and we have commonalities, but we also have individual cultures that are beautiful. And so recognizing that and talking about that too. So a lot of my conversation is about where I'm coming and what I see. As I can talk about being Indian, South Indian very well, because that's my lived experience.
Right. That's a very good point, Annie. And we tend to be lumped together, as I've said before, and expect all of us to be the same when we're not. And each and every one of us, no matter what racial group we belong to, we're all individual, unique human beings. And we need to get to know people. We need to find out commonalities instead of focusing on the difference. I actually wanted to share a story that I forgot to tell about how the model minority has actually drove a wedge between us and Black African Americans. So I was taking a workshop, I think it was about racism or something, and there was a breakout group where they separated people of color from dominant culture folks. And so I was in a separate place. We actually went to a restaurant and we sat there, and there were three of us, a Latina and also a Black woman and myself. So we had a conversation about experiences with racism and everything. And all of a sudden the Black woman turned to me. Now, I have not known her very well. We've seen each other a couple of times, and then also in the class. So we've been together maybe 5 hours. And she all of a sudden turned to me out of context and said, "You Asians are complicit with white people discriminating against us Black Americans. I will never, ever take one of your training classes." I was completely floored because she came out of left field, came out of nowhere. It affected me so much because how do you respond to that, right? In the moment. And so I kept thinking about it the rest of the day. And when the brain is traumatized, we shut down. We can't think, right? And so the cortisol gets running through our veins and we don't know what to say, don't know what to do. So I stopped listening the rest of the class. But at the end of the class, I approached her. I said, "Hey, would you mind if we just sat down and talked for a few minutes? I am a little disturbed by what you said to me earlier." So we sat down and I said to her, "We really don't know each other. Why don't we just share our backgrounds? Because I really seriously been through hell and back. You don't know." So we started sharing, and 45 minutes later, we were crying, we were hugging. And it was just based on how I approached her. So the words that we use, how we frame things is critical on moving things either forward or backward. And ever since then, I understand, actually a friend told me that a year later, when she was asked who she would recommend for training, she said Lillian Tsai. Okay, so that's how you advance these conversations. Do I call it conflict? No, I call it a misunderstanding. I call it, how do you have courageous conversations, crucial conversations? All those are trademarked terms. but I would say brave. And I use the term buckets of courage because that's what I coined that term, buckets of courage. You have to have buckets of courage in order to have these conversations, not to do the shame and blame. Shame and blame does not work in any direction. Thank you for the hearts and the thumbs up. Appreciate that. All right, I am happy to conclude here. If any of you would like to stay and chat a few more minutes, I think we have till 1 o'clock, but I want to thank all of you for being here. So many of you have stayed. I am so grateful. So please link in with me. I'm easy to find. There's not many Lillian Sais around, I don't think, on LinkedIn. I love to connect with any of you who are willing. And thank you again so much. And happy holidays. They are coming up. I'm taking a month off. I'm shutting down for a month because this work is hard. And so I need to rejuvenate and take some time with my grandson and my family. So wishing you happy holidays, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lillian, so much for this informative presentation and raising our consciousness of the history and continued racist ways in which AAPIs are treated. Also for inspiring us to speak up, to be an upstander, and to speak up, especially ways when we are unseen or when we're excluded in the conversation. Thank you all for participating and in this presentation. Please continue to join us in our CTLE presentations and also in our AAPI affinity group. I know Marky has shared that in the chat. Do contact Marky, and we really have a strong AAPI group that so looking forward to seeing you all there. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.